You are listening to the e-flux podcast.
The following conversation was initiated alongside an essay series in e-flux journal titled After Okwui Enwezor, edited by Moses Serubiri. The series reflects on the resounding presence of the late writer, curator, and theoretician. Along with a focus on his many innovative concepts like the post-colonial constellation, the series presents a wide evaluation of Enwezor's curatorial and theoretical practice following other similar initiatives, such as the special issue on Enwezor by the journal he founded, Nka Journal of Contemporary African Art. Moving beyond tributes and biography, the series covers topics such as the relevance of Enwezor's approach to politics, the limits of the exhibition as a form of critique, his conception of modernity and writing on the contemporary, his nomadic epistemology, accounts of his biennials in Seville, Paris, and Venice as institutional critique, and the specific contribution of non-Western artists in the art world. This podcast episode begins with 3 short excerpts selected by Moses to invite Okwui's own voice and words into the room and frame the conversation between K.O. Nnamdie, Thomas Slacks, and Ebony Haynes. Kayode Nnamdie is an artist, writer, curator, and art advisor. Nnamdie ran Restaurant Projects, a curatorial project between 2018 and 2025, based on their interest in the intersection between hospitality and the arts. Ebony Haynes is a senior director at 52 Walker, a David Zwirner gallery space presenting longer format exhibitions with primarily conceptual and research-based artists. T-Lax is a curator of media and performance at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, where he works closely with living artists and other collaborators.
I'm just, so we're listening to the clips and then talking. Okay, great.
We're going to listen to 60 seconds of each video clip that Moses would like us to start the conversation with.
Admire, but also in the context of what I will call a different kind of politics of disaggregation, which is taking place today in the United States. And it's really, in my view, quite important as we go through these moments of social transformation in which various societies in transition are presently deeply engaged with, that we think about the role of art and politics not as 2 separate systems of understanding the present circumstances in which we live and work, and in which artists make their claims within the general dimension of the global public sphere, but also to think about the entanglement of art and politics as an opportunity for provocation, and not necessarily an opportunity for demagoguery. In any case, I could not think of a better artist to bring into this discussion today than the Brazilian artist Cilda Meirelles. My motivation is twofold. First, I want to cast a critical look at one project, Insertions into Ideological Circuits, for which Meirelles has come to be known far more than any other work of his over 40-year career. Like Borges's Fucking Past, Meirelles' insertions operate at the gap between circuits, between material flows, ideological structures, and nodes of value, symbolic, social, economic, and political. The insertions in question are as much cuts inscribed on as they are breaks struck into formal structures of power, broadcast systems and instruments of public transmission. In tactical terms, the insertions represent the brutal scoring onto the sheets of public consciousness of the wild rumors of human existence caught in the grips of unaccountable power.
Okay, so that's one.
So obviously in the new images of man, what we were concerned with was the different, states of the human form and the way those states were articulated in various disciplines, mostly in sculpture and in painting. And of course, there are works that sort of straddle the bridge between realism and of course, and some of the ideas that were being explored in this section of a more kind of visceral, anguished, eviscerated, human forms. And for each artist, we've, tried to, locate not only the most emblematic works, but to, locate works developed during the early stages of the particular language they were, using. And it would seem in some of these works that it should have been titled New Images of, not man, of women. So when you look at this section, what becomes very clear is a network of artists from a range of places on this theme that obviously in the MoMA exhibition did not consider how artists from different parts of the world may have addressed the very nature of the human condition, whether as it applies to the specificity of the regions or the local context, or as it may have applied in terms of the more universal recognition of this particular question. And I will come a little bit to address this in relation to the work of Frantz Fanon and Aimé Césaire's own, questioning and, response to, or if you will, their critique of a particular idea of humanism as it was developed within post-war Western philosophy. Of course, looking at Jean-Paul Sartre, you're here, so you probably, know a lot more about this. And the fourth section is realisms, and here we're really very interested. This painting finally did not make it into the exhibition. One of the difficulties of an exhibition like this, and which, reminded us of, how the increasing impossibility of organizing exhibitions of this scope is just the amount of resources required to make the show. And therefore, for me also, taking that as a point of departure, looking at the frontiers and the boundaries constructed by Catherine, my sense of Documenta was a horizon, the horizon of the possible. And in that sense, I began thinking, initially when I was invited, I thought, what could I possibly contribute to this? My immediate experience of Documenta was only like less than a year, seeing Catherine's show, which not only was very vivid, but absolutely vital. I still remember just about every room. And for me, that's the sign of a great exhibition, that you know what you saw, when and where. I remember the shape of the rooms. I was deeply affected by the Kulturbahnhof, the train station. It was the very first time it was used. On top was Pistoleto's installation with your Getty Menos, and below, directly immediately below, was Elio Otiseka. And this expression of horizontality, between the two exhibitions was for me incredible and powerful. And I say this only to say that the platforms, on the one hand, was a response to two things. One, I had conceived of documentary as having come in three different eras. The first was what I call the Arnold Bode years. Arnold Bode founded documentary in 1955, and this would have been the same time, the same year that the non-aligned movement met in Indonesia. So to talk about histories, I think it's important because it bears a relationship to this notion of horizon that one wanted to construct.
I'm here with two impactful contemporary curators, Ebony and T. We just finished watching 3 clips of Okwui Enwezor. Any response to or anything come up after watching those 3 clips about Okwui?
Shall I begin?
Sure, please.
I think the first thing that comes to mind in hearing Okwi's voice is his incredible presence. He is a man of not just gravitas, but incredible communicative capacity. And so it just feels like he's here with us in some way. And I think that will be maybe a thematic we might return to, is like, in what ways is the ongoing work that Okwui made possible continually here with us. And so I just want to bring a few more of the things that maybe our listeners didn't necessarily see, which is his gesture, his hands. And in the time that I got to spend with him, his hands were something that I remarked upon, that there's a kind of sense of emphasis that he makes, like he's kind of pointing at certain moments to make sure that you're getting the idea. He has this other thing he does where there's like this kind of shift that he's marking. And I'm, for folks who are not with us, putting my 3 fingers out with like a kind of distance and twisting them. And then this horizon or anticipation. So the ways in which his belief in what is here and now, what is in process of becoming, and what is to arrive feel very, very present in who he was and continues to be. So I just wanted to, like, in some way make that felt and not have him be just an idea of a person, as impactful as his ideas were and as his writing continues to be, that like the flesh and blood of him as also a caring person, and a person of incredible grace is also part of his legacy.
I'm glad you mentioned the hand gestures, because I never had the privilege of meeting Okwui, but his way of speaking and his poise, as T mentioned, even in how he chooses to express himself or deliver the message, has always been very poignant for me. But when I watched these clips, I wrote a note down that just said grad school in my phone, because I was very taken early on by what I made assumptions about this Nigerian-born curator coming from a place of being the only Black person in the room often when talking about art. And the need for this kind of poise and ability to communicate when there were situations which I can only assume were more than difficult, but just stoic, just trying to understand at a young age for me how he could deal with the room. How can he deal with the stares or somebody making a false claim that they can't understand him? This story, somebody told me about this racist encounter he had where somebody said they didn't speak his language, but he was speaking English. That always stuck with me. And the need to be able to move through those moments in a world, the art world is so predominantly white, and do such amazing things. I mean, that's what stands out for me. It's like this poise is the summary of that long diatribe. That's what I think about when I see those clips.
I also didn't get the pleasure of meeting Okwui either. I had come into contact with his great work and legacy around 2020, 2021. And I was just like amazed by this person. And I'm a Nigerian born person as well. And I just, when I thought there was, I didn't think there was another person like me that was outside of my life that was doing the work that he was doing. And then when I finally was sinking my teeth into it, he had passed. And it was really tough to like think like, oh my gosh, I won't ever get to interface with this person. But like through talking to fellows that did know Okwui and watching videos like this, the presence and his cadence does come across. And I almost believe, I have to believe that he knew that the work he was doing was greater than himself. It wasn't about him. So maybe that gave him the strength to interface and be in those rooms where race was the big topic at hand, or maybe the only topic. And yeah, how someone moves through that with grace or elegance, I have no idea.
Well, can I just, very timely that we're having this discussion in the middle of my exhibition with Glenn Ligon and Julius Eastman, because Glenn, who did know Okwui, shared a really great story about, one, you knew Okwui? Yes. That he was very funny. And you wouldn't maybe discern that from a clip like the ones that we just watched, which made me think of this decision to be poised in a particular room, right? And Glenn shared a story. So my current show right now is based on a score by Julius Eastman called Evil Nigger. And Okwui, when he curated the 2015 Venice Biennale, had an arena, which I'd only been able to read about, I didn't go that year, of performances that happened every day. And he ended the entire Biennale with a performance of Evil Nigger. And the way people who knew him well, like Glenn, talk about it is, he knew what he was doing, You invited me to do this thing, and I did it, and you want to contextualize it as the political Biennale. I'll show you political. I'm paraphrasing and probably reinterpreting it in a way that I would envision it happening, but finding ways to create these new horizons and spaces that you feel are important are difficult and very special once you achieve them. That's what I think about.
I totally agree, Ebony, that he used his sense of humor as a way of, in some moments, clowning what the kind of stereotypical location of power was assumed to be. So I remember him telling the story. I had a chance to, for a week, shadow him, which is like a funny term because it's like he is the sun. So it's like, it was basically when he was the director of the Haus der Kunst. I went there for a week as part of a mentorship program called CCL and got to just kind of see him doing his everyday activities. And he recounted the story of his arrival in the United States when he flew at age 17 to Newark, New Jersey. And he had reserved what he thought was a limousine because he was coming to the United States for the first time. And that's exactly how he imagined he would arrive. And lo and behold, to his surprise, what he imagined being a limousine was basically a van, like a kind of like a broke down van. And what he said was like, I quickly realized what America was.
Wow.
And so like taking the kind of grandeur that is projected from this country all over the world and realizing that that's just a projection and effectively saying like, oh, the limousine has arrived. Like he is bringing with him all of that sense of possibility and projection of his own person into the world. Mm-hmm. So I think, and he said it as a joke. And so it's exactly what you're describing, Ebony, this like sense of, using humor to kind of flip the sets of expectations that people have about the kinds of asymmetries that structure geopolitical value relations in our world. Mm-hmm.
I'm not shocked to hear that Okwui was funny, just knowing that Nigerians are incredibly humorous and incredibly dramatic. So the idea of like someone for him not to tap into that would be, I think, a shame if he didn't. But it is great to know that he was able to move through so many different rooms and still be able to hold to his own. Again, I never met him, but just through some of the videos that I've seen and some of the exhibitions that I've gotten to see through just online, because I haven't been able to travel to see them. Only one show I did get to see, which was actually co-curated with Glenn Ligon, I believe, at the New Museum.
Grief and Grievance.
Yeah.
That was, Okwui started the show and sadly passed before it opened. But Glenn was a curator, Naomi Massimiliano, Pioni, and
Mark Nash.
Mark Nash, yeah.
That exhibition was so meaningful to me because that was the first that I would get to see, even if it was posthumous. And I went with my notebook and took notes and really just was like amazed by the possibilities as a curator, as an artist, as a person of color, just to see the space that was allotted, that was earned and deserved. And I wanted to talk a little bit about an exhibition, Ebony, that you did a while ago. And one of these clips speaks about a curator's impact being that you can actually remember and recall where each artwork was in the space. And there are a few exhibitions for me that is the case with you. But the very first one was with Kayode and Jessica Vaughan. It was at Martos. And I'm blanking on the name now.
Man.
Thank you so much.
It's okay.
I remember exactly where every single work was. I mean, I also remember not knowing a damn thing, really, about what was going on. I remember being, it's great that you wrote down grad school. I'm always hoping to be a learner. I don't ever want to not be learning. That show really changed a lot for me. Same with another show that you did with Juliana Huxtable and Carolyn Lazard. I think that was in 2017.
Epigenetic.
Yeah, that exhibition. I mean, it took me, I think, 2 or 3 years to really realize
You're being way too generous.
No, I'm not. I'm actually not. Just being very, very honest. And it's a nice opportunity that I get to say it now here, but I would have told you this off camera as well. I wanted to ask you if you could speak about either of those exhibitions and how you arrived at that, and if if you could speak about those shows and how you arrived at those shows.
Sure. Very overly generous, though. I mean, the reason I feel it's overly generous, I mean, I won't call it imposter syndrome, but I do truly believe that curatorial practice is a practice. So I think that I'm always still in practice. And I think really good curators, like my colleagues at this table, are. I never fully see a show while I'm leading up to it or even when it's on and up. It takes me so long to really appreciate or understand what the final result was of usually years of ideating and planning. But Invisible Man was a show that I had been thinking about, not specifically those artists or title, but Black figuration and how Black figuration had been in my time, which had been very short up to that point of that show, maybe 7 years working in the New York art world, how it's contextualized the narratives around Black figuration and how quite literally the Black body needs to be visible for somebody to appreciate a Black authorial voice or the context of it being a Black artist or a Black curator. Like, Blackness needed to be seen. Like, where is the Black body? And yet we are so invisible in the conversation at large in so many ways. So few of us are at the table of decision makers in institutions, on boards, gallery owners, directors. I mean, we can count these people. Many of us know everyone. I can speak, I'm being very regional, and understandably in my description of these worlds. I'm speaking specifically for me about New York and maybe regionally America, but I thought very intentionally around what it meant for me to be named the director of a space and what I was going to do with that platform. And how did I title it? I mean, a lot of my shows are titled after books or songs, and it starts with a title. And then I look to work as curators do that we've been looking at for a long time. And it just kind of came together organically with artists I was really excited about, which is what's important as a curator too, right? Like we are storytellers. I chose artists who were illustrating the story of Black voices and creators who were finding a way to be in the room without showing, I'm using quotation marks here for listeners, but Blackness. And that was really the first, not the beginning of me mining that side of my practice. And I'm not anti-figuration. I feel like I always have to couch my comments about figuration versus non-figuration. I'm not anti-painting. I get a lot of accusations or labels around my practice. I'm interested in a different lane because the one that I'm countering exists a bit more broadly in my mind. And I was interested in seeing what Blackness in a gallery could look like or feel like without showing Blackness. And that was Invisible Man. And Epigenetic was also not titled after a book, but based on a book. It was based on Bloodchild by Octavia Butler. And Juliana, Carolyn, and I, we had a little sort of like, I call it a book club, but it was just one story. But I presented both of them with the story, and over the course of a year, we had, lovely dinner parties and teas and talked about the story and what we wanted to do together. And I mean, they both created something beautiful together in conversation, and I figured out how to make it and install it on a shoestring. This is at Shoot the Lobster, which feels like a decade ago, but
it was a while ago.
It was a while ago, yeah.
Yeah. Thank you for answering that.
Yeah.
T, you co-organized an exhibition at MoMA called, the Judson Dance Theater. And I didn't know much about any of this, although I did go. I used to work at Participant Inc., and I actually got into dance more because I was working there. I wanted to actually ask you about the importance of movement or dance in these spaces.
Well, I'm gonna tie it back because I'm that kind of a student or something.
I wanted to tie it back too. I want to tie it back too.
Well, I can say I organized the show that you are describing as a collaboration, and it was a show that came about because in some ways the afterlife of Judson Dance Theater felt very present, and specifically within the downtown New York community that I came up in. And so specifically Dance Space Project, which is an organization that's been around for 50 years, and that is a kind of custodian of that history of using everyday movement, of using the types of gestures and capacities that we have at our immediate disposal to make dances, is the kind of tradition that they keep alive. And they have a series that they've organized through their director, Judy Hussey-Taylor, called Platforms. And Platforms, of course, is a direct reference to the documenta that Okwui was just describing, where he decided that he wanted to kind of use the opportunity of this mega show to occur around the world and to have it be the occasion for people to come together and have conversations rather than be the kind of endpoint of a thinking process. And so in thinking about all the different ways that Okui's work lives on, like this kind of model of the platform just is so continually present. And there are other kind of echoes of his work, but I think, all that to say, they're unlikely places in which you might find. So like in thinking about a group of mostly white dancers in the early 1960s, like what does that have to do with, theories of diaspora and post-coloniality and a kind of global contemporary? Everything, it turns out. And I think that like the kind of expansive sense of locatedness but also encyclopedic curiosity that Okwui embodied is expressed through the kind of possibilities that his way of thinking continues to live itself out.
And just
Can I just say something? Because when I was speaking about my own exhibitions, there's an interview that Okwui did with Asia Society. I want to say it was 2015, maybe 2014, but that's how I had a lot of access to Okwui early on, was through online forums, interviews, conversations. And the then new director of Asia Society asked Okwui, I always remember this, again, maybe this is part of his body language and trying to suppress the humor that wants to come out, but she says something along the lines of the new curator, or the new the newness and the context for curation, or the curator's new role. And Okwui, I recall this so clearly. I wish we should play this just for you guys to see after. And he shifts in his seat and he's like, curators haven't changed. The thinking around what a curator is has changed, and it always does, because the things globally, the mindset, political system, like socio-political structures around us changes. And it, so poignantly saying that the curator's role, a great curator who is constantly in practice and aware of their surroundings, responds to that shift. His role hasn't changed, but things are changing, and it's really our duty to appreciate read the room, essentially. That's what I think about when I think about Okwui.
Just for clarity, I mentioned those two exhibitions that you both have done because I feel like they are quite in line with Okwui and his legacy. And thinking about rigorous exhibitions that really, for me, I'm interested in exhibitions that really ruminate in your head and your body for 5 to 7 years. I really think about longevity, which I feel like, again, those two shows, and those aren't the only ones, but those two shows that I brought up were indeed those moments where I also was learning too. So, yeah.
I have a question for you, Ko. A few words I wrote down after those videos. Okwui talking about marking horizons, breaks from the past, newness in the context of curation, and thinking of how to make your mark, or something about marking horizons, and being a driving factor in that. I mean, how do you see that in your practice? Because you have had an interesting through line between independent. Also, Okwui said that there's no such thing as an independent curator, which I neither agree nor disagree with, but his answer was, you can't quite disagree with Okwui. It's just like, it's not an independent, but it's I can't recall the quote, but it's something along the lines of like an untethered or an unattached curator, because you cannot truly be independent. You are always within a context, whether you're curating the show at an institution you work at or seemingly you don't work at, but there is a transaction involved in an understanding that you're going to do something for someone else, so you're not truly independent.
Yeah, that's true.
But you have had all of those roles, I know, and I've seen as a, participant, anonymous, air quotes again, independent. How do you think about horizons for you and like working on shows?
I will say also, just to dovetail off of what you had just said regarding Okwui and his phrase or his thinking around independent or not independent, it's absolutely true. A poet by the name of Ajwa Greaves has said, "We are never not touching," and it's absolutely true. As much as I could think I was independent, I had people such as yourself or minds such as Okwi's that were a guiding force. How do I navigate the landscape?
Finding this idea of a new horizon when you are moving through various spaces that potentially contextually are meant to be a catalyst or platform for a different narrative, whether it's a not-for-profit space or a commercial space or a space that you've been invited to come into and are not employed by, like there's a balance in that. I'm just wondering if you contend with a balance, or if that ever becomes something that you have to think about.
As someone who's an artist first and foremost, I really just try to remember that I'm a creative person. And so there are a lot of problems that come up and a lot of problem solving that needs to be, quickly addressed. But for the most part, I'm not sure if I'm answering this question properly, but whenever there are challenges going on, I always go back to artists and I try to ask them what they're doing. My ear is always close to them. I'm always trying to see what artists need. And yeah, I just wanted to raise a point about something that you mentioned regarding curators. And when I first started coming up into some sort of realm, a few journalists would say something that was rather off-putting, which was, are you ready to be a star? Are you ready to do this or that? And, the job that I do as a curator, I take it as seriously as any other Nigerian would, but it's not about me. I mean, I get to tell people stories. I do relate it closely a little bit to acting. And I'm not acting when I'm working with artists, but I get to bring stories up onto a stage and allow them to shine. So yeah, I never really thought I'd be in this seat. I worked at a place called Participant and I worked at Anonymous. I just really, the love of the artist is what is always going to be my driving force, regardless of what comes around the corner.
I noticed that these clips were largely about a specific era of curating and shows, specifically post-war and the kind of fall of modernism or postmodernism. Why is that? Do you know? Or was there an intention behind those clips?
Moses picking those?
Mm-hmm.
I was not privy to those reasons. Do any come to mind for you or UT?
I guess maybe something I can say about post-war. It was a show I saw with Okwui, the only show that he made that I got to see with him. And I think that it's a show that's so much a description of our own time now. He was working on 3 shows. Okwui, had a sense of ambition that I think is unrivaled in what I've experienced. In his forthcoming book of collected writings, it's 2 volumes, and Terry Smith, who edited it, said that he had to read more than 1 million published words that Okwui had contributed. And the book for Postwar is 800 pages, just to give you a sense of like the sheer belief in the capacity of knowledge and the kind of touching and sharing and collective practice that you're describing, Kayode. I think what remains to be known in the post moment is like Okwui not only came up with all of that, working with other people, but like proposed these 3 shows, first post-war, then post-colonial, then post-communism. And the post-colonial, which never came to pass, or we're living in it in some way, he described as like wanting to be specifically about post-coloniality, not through state formation in the 1960s and 70s, but through the ways that non-state actors, the radical left, often through violent means, were attempting to try to create something that was the destruction of coloniality. Mm. And that's like such a wild shift in the way that I think we oftentimes think about post-colonization as like the emergence of, the great African state. It's like, no. That's not actually what it's about. And I think what we're living through, what we're about to live through in the US at least, and elsewhere through the rise of authoritarianism is also the use of force on the left, militaristic and counter-militaristic force. Mm-hmm. And I think that he was attempting to write that history that, in many ways, the kind of neoliberal left that has been the kind of center of major museums across Europe and the United States would never touch as like an idea of the post-colonial. So I think that's just one. And I think the Grief and Grievance exhibition that you mentioned earlier is another that I can, like that formulation that he came up with after Donald Trump was elected the first time to become the president of the United States, like that there was this idea of like white grievance and black grief. Like it like is such a helpful formulation for thinking about the stakes of our time. So yeah, so I guess the postness of where we found ourselves is also, I think, about like the kind of unfinished work or the post of Okwi's life and the way that he kind of I don't know. I've been thinking about this idea recently of like the prophet of the past, prophecies of the past, which is a formation by Glissant, who Okwui was inspired by. But like, there's a way that there is something prophetic in these kinds of anticipatory horizons, and that we are now in the process of living through, and that the kind of fearlessness, because that's the word when I think of Okwui, the first word that comes to mind is fearless. And it's a word that he used a lot. And again, like almost as a kind of synonym for grace. And I think that we would all benefit to have some level of that fearlessness in relationship to recounting the past and imagining how it might be a kind of, like a roadmap for what lies ahead. So that's how I read the postness that we've been called to.
I often associate the post with, it's interesting that I agree with you in your description of Okui's postness and using that as a lens to mine ideas and then use art to illustrate those ideas. Very selfishly, bringing this to me and my idea of post and that those phrases, I actually spent my entire postgrad education talking about language that specifically tried to contextualize moments of Blackness as post something. And I associate it often with a lack of ability to ground a conclusion in what preceded it. So before we can even understand what we just lived through, we have to try to understand the post. And then that gets a post, You can't say identity politics and then we're post-Black and then we're post-race and then we're post. It's like, well, what happened to Black and race and identity? We didn't resolve anything. And I think it's interesting. I'm not proposing any sort of conclusion or a better way to interpret these phrases or assign categories to these moments in time and eras. But I do think it's interesting, or for me, post becomes this way to think about the horizon because we have not been able to contend with what preceded it.
Well said. When I think about Okui's work, and you had spoken about, or you said the word horizon, I often look at some of his older shows, really older shows, and I didn't mention it earlier in your question, but that's actually one of the guiding kind of North Stars. I look at older shows to be able to almost see the signs for the future, what might be shaking up. I guess what I'm really getting ready to ask you both, if this is all right, is if at any clear moment do you make exhibitions to directly be in dialogue what's happening politically, or what might be happening down the road? Because I know I do sometimes make exhibitions that I'm thinking, okay, 6 years down the road, these things might happen, these bills might get passed, this stuff might be happening. How do I speak to that future person without, being a paranoid? But how do I, I guess for better lack of a term, how do I future trip and try to, discuss some things with that future self or my community over there?
It's a really nice question.
I mean, I'm going to be so honest right now that I might ask you to cut it out, but I don't want to sound like I'm not intentional with shows and research, but I would say it's accurate to describe my curatorial practice as very tunnel vision, where it might behoove me to think a bit more about future and or current and or past. Sometimes those moments appear more pointedly in shows I'm thinking about, but more often than not, I'm just thinking about putting these two artists together because I know the kind of conversation I want them to have. I mean, a perfect example, because I've just given a talk about the show that's up right now. How could I have known Trump's inauguration would have been the same week that my show titled Evil Nigger was opening, with the violence that he has incited within the communities of color immediately with just the platforms he was proposing, cutting funding, striking initiatives that provided or continued accessibility and visibility that has been so lacking and continues to lack. And here comes this exhibition, so somebody just asked me if I was thinking about that when planning the opening. And I was like, how could I have known? But I don't think I consider it enough, and maybe I should. Do you consider future lenses of reading your shows, team?
Well, I see in what you're describing, and in my own experience of tunnel vision might also be described as like intuition, focus, intimacy, all of which have like an incredible amount of knowledge. No, and I think that those are the terms that are on the table from the kind of study that we're doing. And so that's about something better than history and better than politics, which is to say, like, those parts of the past that escape historical formulation. And I think I'm catching up with what you were saying before about Okwi's relationship to post, that like they're all of these forms of what goes under the term, modernism and postmodernism that like were not captured through those terms. And so that there's actually like some other set of ways of knowing
totally
that have to come through. And this is maybe one place where I might depart from like Okwi's thinking. Is I would describe his thinking as kind of avant-gardist, or emphatically, not kind of, emphatically avant-gardist, that like art offered a place to, like, a vantage point to critique the like culture industry writ large. And we're in such a upside down warped universe where like there's no place to sit outside of it. And so like what it means to act on politics, and to think in a way conventionally around like how you attempt to imagine what is coming down by politically is like is going to require a whole other set of like deep entanglement with the very forces that we're fighting against, and in that way, like I think the kind of like intensity of vision that you're describing will increasingly be the place that we look to as a resource, because there are other kinds of habits, modes, ways of inhabitation with others that emerge from there, that like are not registered under the rubric of the political. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense.
That makes sense.
It's like not quite tunnel vision, but you're focused on the finish line. You're focused on the goal, and regardless of what happens outside, your intuition has sparked this, fire, and you need to fuel it to the finish line. And you don't need to think about what happens when you get to the finish line. Just get there.
Right. Which that makes a lot of sense for the show that you made happen, of course, with Glenn's support and other people's support. I meant with that question also, by the way, thanks for answering that. But sometimes there are many ways that I'll like attack a show. It just depends. And sometimes it will just be an Erykah Badu song or lyric, or I will just hear someone passing by say something. But, you spoke about the magic of, I don't know if you consider this magic, but you spoke about the magic of the exhibition, the vernissage of the show happening on such a crazy week. I think that's really just like the magic, and the show gets to lean into all that.
I do think, true to, turning it back to Okwui and how the exhibition becomes so timely, even everything we're talking about now with trying to be post something or this like focused vision, what maybe is marking horizons, or, how Okwui has talked so poignantly about working within the space you're given. Trying to create space for yourself and thinking about ways of working in new models and new modes of curating and conversation and narratives. That it doesn't really matter when Evil Nigger happened or post-colonialism, 'colonialism, you know, it, as a show, I think, the time with which they are conceived and then hit the finish line is the only time they could happen. And then people just draw connections naturally to the moment or the understanding, the reception of that show. And it would happen that way at any time. Your show could have happened around performance, and it could have been a different moment, and then people would understand it differently. I think it's just interesting to consider how we try to find value in receiving the information and the messaging. Again, these are all just kind of questions I ask myself too. Right. There's no kind of conclusion, but the medium or the message. Mm. Is it the timing, or are we creating the time because of the show? The show might actually be sparking the message. And it's just a lens for people to see something in the immediate.
Right, and I think about that too with a few of Okwi's shows, that the exhibition, in fact, is the portal in which we get to walk through, and it's not always the opposite, which the opposite would be, in this time that the show happened, it was really a shakeup. I mean, I think sometimes, I can't speak for every curator because, I mean, again, I'm like a self-taught kind of curator, so I didn't really do the whole uni thing. But to a point that you had made earlier, Ebony, which this is something that Moses had mentioned before, is that he had believed that Okwui and I had a lot of similar experiences kind of coming into the art world, like how it was not intentional for him to have the job that he had initially, his working on the Bowery. Do you know anything about, or can you offer any information about Okwi's time on the Bowery?
What your story feels very resonant with Okwi's coming into the art world, having studied political science, and not the kind of like fancy curator school that many people are encouraged to go to. Mm-hmm. And I think the thing that he studied most, perhaps, I think throughout his whole career, was poetry. He first identified as a poet, and I think often in just reading him, like, he goes back to the kind of storytelling that comes through in the spoken word of poetry. And so I think the place that he called home, maybe for the first time when he arrived in New York, was in the East Village. And because of the relationship of his going to listen and read his own work in the 1980s in that neighborhood, but then the kind of collective work that he was doing in that space, also kind of starting an alternative art space, which feels in many ways like subterfuge that both of y'all are doing, which is to say, like, using these kind of established forms, but doing something totally different inside of them than what they're meant to be doing. And also, like, refusing to even name that work as necessarily under a different name. Like, that it's like, yeah, we can call this a commercial gallery, and it's a whole other thing that's happening in there. And I see a similar thing with the way that when he was working with Neri Ward and constructing their own space, Akadibia, Hand of the Seer, that there was this kind of like ability to use this ready-made structure of gathering, but to do the thing that they wanted to do. Mm-hmm. And I think the other place that he transited quite easily was to institutions of great power. He could recount, in the same way that he was talking about Catherine David's Documenta and Memory of the Rooms, he remembered the sight lines of primitivism at MoMA in 1984, and with a sense of rageful need for correction. And so I think the fact that he was moving across these different locations, that even if they might have been close in proximity, other folks were not moving with the same level of fluidity. He could bring the critique he had of this show that, only used African art as a kind of source for Western modernism to create an alternative in the here and now of his life. And so, yeah, I think a lot of the kind of places that he moved through were about, I think, like, not claiming a unitary place from which he hailed, and being able to, like, as a truly, he as much as he self-identifying as Nigerian, he also was a Black American Brooklynite in his life too. Like I think he like claimed the sense of possibility of those two things as not in conflict, but actually like the two things. And I don't know if this resonates for you personally, but I think for many people, many artists who he championed, and like when you just like look at the number of like monographic essays he wrote about artists, it's in the hundreds. So like in addition to doing all of these like the most major groups, or, you know, thematic shows, he's also just writing these 5,000, 10,000 word essays on many other people who share that same sense of multiply locatedness. Does that, I don't know if that resonates with any of your own sense of self and coming into this world.
It resonates completely. I almost had forgotten that he was a wizard in words and was a beautiful wordsmith. So thank you for bringing that back into my memory. And also Nari. I first learned about this artist, embarrassingly, through that show, I believe. Actually, no, Nari did a show at New Museum. I think there was a solo show. But I learned about the relationship between Okwui and Nari and other artists, and how much of a patron and a friend he was to these people behind the scenes, and wasn't, working with them in only this way of putting on an exhibition. And I'm pretty sure that you both do the same with other artists as well, and work with them off the scenes as like a real person and see them as a real person. I'm trying to think of if there are any maybe closing remarks that you might have. I mean, I guess
there are two things, and then I'll stop talking.
Okay,
no,
cool.
ahead.
Yeah.
Okay, one of them
is
just like how important it was that he was the director of the Hausdruckkunst.
Yeah.
Which like he was, just to say, he's like the first Black director of any major European museum. Period. And the way that he showed up to this museum, Munich is the place where the Nazi Party was supported financially. The families,
they still have the stage where Hitler's last speech was. Someone could correct me, but I recall seeing this stage that has been kept in place intact.
You
for
feel
orations. You feel it, yeah.
And the same families that supported that stage are living around the museum. You walk underneath like the like loggia to enter into the building, and like the mosaics above you are like decorative swastikas. So like that's, he's entering that building, and what he decided to do was create the first position for somebody to be an archivist of the museum's history, to tell a long story that would be ongoing and active in a permanent gallery devoted to that legacy. So I think like the firstness is less about a kind of biographical, kind of claim or sense of greatness, and more about like, okay, so once you access a space, like what is it that you do differently that can transform that sense of grief, even if it's not one's own, even if the grief is about another form of dispossession, into shifting the terms of engagement in some way. Okay, the other story I'm going to tell, and then I'll stop.
Don't stop.
It's just it's a personal story, which is in my house, in my mom's house in New York. My mom has a Seydou Keita photograph as the poster from the first major exhibition that Okwui organized here in New York City at the Guggenheim Insight, that she went to go see, and bought this, boxed out this poster and kind of hung it up. So this is like this kind of poster that I just grew up with before I knew who Okwui Enwezor was. And yeah, I just wanted to pair that with a recollection that he shared with me when I was with him in Munich, which was, we had met with there was like a new social media manager who had like just started that week, and he was like sitting down with her and talking about like, how do you do tech stuff? And she left, and he was very, incredibly polite and incredibly interested and curious in what she had to say. But when she left, he was kind of like, oh, I mostly get my, my tech advice from my mom. And his mom, who was, in Southeast Nigeria, and like just giving him advice about like all the new phones, and how to kind of like, she was constantly switching phones, and how to like be able to use that sense of innovation that comes from just having to communicate with people who are far away. Again, an experience for many of us that's very regular, as like the way that he was going about doing the Hausdruckkunst media, in addition to listening to his young colleague. But I say that just to like humanize this person again. And, you know, he was the youngest with a number of older sisters. And I think like some of the, you know, the ways that those parts of who we are inform what we do is really important just for us to, you know, in his passage to ask how he can, you know, in the individual people who carry forth his legacy. So just those other things I just want to make sure that were said on the podcast.
I'm glad you said them.
Ebony, do you have any closing remarks?
I do, but should I say them is the question.
I think it's a yes.
I feel like I'm trying to find the words to express how much I appreciate Okwi's paving of the way. Again, I can't speak to having met him, but one thing I've long admired is how much his name resonates with so many artists I admire and do know personally. And to think of holding that much influence and to be able to conjure excitement in an artist, so much so seeing, you know, Okwi's name as an email sender or invitation to a show and the invitation to be contextualized by someone like him, I can only aspire to. And I completely respect how diplomatic he didn't have to be. You know, I don't think it was calculated, but I often think about how much of my voice I want to use and when. And that's really what I felt from just observing Okwui from the margins. And I'm in constant awe and have the utmost respect for the decades of that kind of movement and the imprint it has left on so much of the art world. I mean, can't we only hope for an artist to be excited by our contextualization of their work? You know, he said also, he recounted this idea of needing to do the work and prove his ability, you know, this kind of art historian legacy that he developed through his true ability and knowledge as a writer and historian and researcher and orator. I mean, that was real. But there's this understanding, if you are not somebody who's usually in the room, that you need to prove you have the chops to decide when and if and how you want to use those chops. You know, it might have, the exhibition might fall differently if you hadn't published a certain amount or shown that you can research and acknowledge and create this chronology that leads up to where you are before you can create your own story. And I think about that a lot as somebody who didn't formally study art history. And being constantly, I did teach it though. And then I learned that as long as you read the textbook, you're one step ahead of the Art History 101 students. I feel like listeners are going to come for me for some of the things I'm saying. Yeah, I think a lot of things I have absorbed from Okwui just continue to resonate. Like there are these quips of him that I'm sure I could footnote and reference based on a Google search, but the way he delivers the message just is quite poignant. And I think about them a lot with what I do in the space that I create for myself.
Yeah, I think about Okwi's commitment, and really I think a lot about how Okwui, I feel, would have done this no matter what, the work, no matter what. And even posthumous, the work is still being done. I mean, it affects and resides in people such as myself and outside of myself as well. And I had a bit of a selfish question to ask you both. Maybe this will be the last question, which is, do you have any advice for any young curators coming into the fold?
Are you trying to say that we are not the young curators?
I'm trying to say we are very young and elastic. No, I know that we're all young.
No, I joke.
For the new curators that are coming in, I get this question a lot on DMs or emails, and I mean, I don't feel like I have the answer, Sway, but some people might think that.
I remember when he was invited by Rosalie Goldberg, when Okwui was invited by Rosalie Goldberg to perform a gala. Did anybody hear this? Was anybody there for that? So usually like at a gala, people get he was the honoree. Usually at a gala, when you're honored, you go up, you say some nonsense. Thank you so much. I love you. Whatever. Something that is empty. Okwui, not being a traditional person in this kind of mannered way, but really believing in sharing knowledge, decided he wanted to use the opportunity to make sure that everybody in that room knew that. And there had just been a show at MoMA about abstraction and its invention. It's called Inventing Abstraction, that was located in Europe in the early 20th century. And he wanted to make sure everybody in that room knew that abstraction had not been invented in Europe in the early 20th century, but several centuries earlier in West Africa. And it was just like such a beautiful and bold claiming of truth and space and using the kind of nonsense that we just kind of habituate ourselves to do something very different. And I remember him saying something about hoping or wishing for a moment in which like Black folks could get to be as mediocre as their white counterparts. And that to me was just like, there's just so much in there that kind of like continues to, I don't know where to stand on that. Like, is that a goal? And I think he was joking, but also like there's a desire in there.
Of course.
And I like want to just throw out every possible version of that. Like, we have to be better than. No.
Right.
We get to be just as bad. No.
Yeah.
And I don't know what the other thing is. And I think it has to do with, some other attempt to try to do this thing with the sense of fearlessness that doesn't necessarily have to attend to what's happened before. And I think if anything maybe is attempt, if there's any spirit, I think that we are bringing forth together in Okwui, it's that. It looks totally different because it has to necessarily.
Right.
It's a refusal of Black excellence and Black mediocrity towards something else wild.
If I were giving advice, I kind of, a little dovetail off of what you're saying, but not finding a space that we can't quite name yet. Again, not trying to be mediocre or excellent. I would advise young curators not to sweat the big stuff, not even the small stuff, because people will perceive what they want of your work, whether they have really understood or comprehended what your intentions were or not. One time a collector told me that they were surprised Gordon Matta Clark was in my program when I was sharing the upcoming program, the Gordon Matta Clark and Pope.L show. And I said, oh, really? Why?
One of the best shows in New
so
York
amazing.
in the last 10 years.
Well, it was one of the most rewarding shows for me because they're two of my top five. I mean, thinking of ways to put them in conversation together, this was my chance, So I was super excited. And I had told this collector, it was in December of 2023 in Miami at Art Basel. And they have longtime supporters of mine before 52 Walker. And it's like, what's coming up next? And I said, oh, Gordon Matta Clark, Pope.L. And they said, oh, that's a bit different for you. And I was kind of surprised. I was like, really? I love Gordon Matta Clark and Pope.L. I've worked with Pope.L before. She's like, no, but like it's Black art. And I was just like, I laugh about it now because that's my advice, is like, you just cannot let that affect what your intentions and visions are for your practice or your space or whatever you're trying to do, because people will see what they want and always create their own narrative if that's what they're only interested in, that, and you won't be able to change it. There's a large group of people who will hear you and see you, and that's what you should care about. Don't worry about someone misinterpreting or pigeonholing or saying that you have created a space for something they can only absorb, because otherwise they can't contend with why you have Gordon Matta Clark or even, Nicole Eisenman. Don't dismiss the fact that they're two of my favorite artists and they're formidable in their own practices. But she did say to me, I said, that's so interesting why you think that. She's like, well, perception is reality. You come in the space and everyone, your front desk, you have Black gallery assistants. She didn't say it like that, but she was implying that. And I was like, well, when you walk into a gallery and see only white people, what is your perception? You know, it's so some of the world. This isn't a grand statement. I don't think everybody is lazy or misinterprets, but there is a section who will see what they want, and don't worry about them. That's my advice in a nutshell. Keep your tunnel vision. It will land on who it should land on, and that's all that matters.
And with that, I would love to just thank you, Ebony and T, both for joining me on this conversation about Okwui Enwezor and his legacy, importance, and thank you both so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.